The wedding lasted exactly 27 minutes before everything fell apart, and I remember thinking, as I stood there in my pale blue dress, that dignity doesn't shatter loudly, it slips away in small, quiet moments no one else notices until it's too late. He arrived at the chapel just after 10 in the morning, the sun already warming the stone steps, guests gathering in clusters of laughter and perfume and polite conversation, and for a brief moment, I allowed myself to believe this would be a good day, the kind of day you tell stories about later, the kind where a mother watches her son begin a new life and feels nothing but pride. Daniel had always been a good man, steady, soulful, the kind of son who still called every Sunday and remembered how I took my coffee, and when he introduced me to Emily 2 years ago, I told myself she would be the daughter I never had, someone to share holidays with, someone who would stand beside him and build something lasting. The chapel doors were open, white roses lining the aisle, soft music drifting through the air, and everything looked exactly the way it should, which is perhaps why I ignored the first small signs that something was off. Victoria Carter, Emily's mother, greeted me near the entrance, her smile sharp at the edges, her eyes scanning me in a way that felt less like welcome and more like assessment, as if I were a detail she hadn't approved of but had decided to tolerate. "Margaret," she said, her voice sweet but measured, "you made it," and I nodded, smoothing the fabric of my dress, pretending not to notice how quickly her gaze moved on. Inside, guests filled the pews, the air humming with anticipation, and I took my seat near the front, close enough to see Daniel clearly when he would walk down the aisle, close enough to catch the small expressions that mothers learn to read without words. Emily stood near the altar, radiant in her gown, laughing softly with her bridesmaids, and for a moment, everything aligned into something almost perfect. But perfection has a way of cracking under pressure, and sometimes all it takes is a single sentence spoken just loud enough. It happened as people were settling into their seats, a ripple of conversation moving through the room, when Victoria stepped slightly forward, adjusting her shawl, her voice rising just enough to carry across the first few rows. "Well," she said, with a light laugh that wasn't their light at all, "I suppose every wedding has its imperfections." A few polite chuckles followed, the kind people offer when they're unsure if they should laugh at all, and I felt a small tightening in my chest, the kind you ignore because you don't want to be the one who makes things uncomfortable. Then she turned her head slightly, just enough, and her eyes landed on me, her smile widening in a way that didn't reach her eyes. "That's not a mother," she added, clearly, deliberately, "that's a mistaken address." The words didn't echo, not really, but they didn't need to. They settled into the room like dust, visible only when the light hits just right, and for a second, everything slowed. He could hear the faint rustle of fabric, the quiet intake of breath from someone nearby, the subtle shift of bodies as people pretended not to look while looking anyway. And then, just as quickly, there was laughter, soft at first, then a little louder, and among it, unmistakable, was Emily's voice, bright and amused, as if the moment were harmless, as if I were harmless, as if I were something that could be dismissed with a joke. He felt my hands fold neatly in my lap, my back straightening just a little, and I smiled, not because it was funny, but because I understood something in that instant that I hadn't allowed myself to see before. Across the aisle, Daniel stood waiting, his posture still, his expression unreadable, and for the first time that morning, he wasn't looking at Emily. It was looking at me. He did not look away, not immediately, because there is a moment when humiliation tries to force your eyes down, when it tells you to shrink, to disappear, to make things easier for everyone else, and I had spent far too many years doing exactly that without even realizing it. Instead, I kept my gaze steady, not on Victoria, not on the scattered reactions of strangers pretending to be polite, but on my son, because in that single glance, I needed to understand whether I was standing in that room alone or not. Daniel had always been composed, the kind of man who thought before he spoke, who avoided unnecessary conflict, who believed that respect was something you maintained quietly rather than demanded out loud, but there was something different in his face now, something I had not seen since he was a boy standing up to a schoolyard bully twice his size. His jaw tightened just slightly, his shoulders squared, and for a second, the entire room seemed to hold its breath without knowing why. The officiant cleared his throat softly, attempting to gather the moment back into something orderly, something acceptable, as if the ceremony could continue as planned if everyone simply pretended nothing had happened. A few guests shifted in their seats, murmuring under their breath, the low hum of discomfort spreading like a ripple through water, but no one spoke, no one corrected the insult, no one said what should have been obvious, and that silence told me more than the words ever could. Emily adjusted the lace at the edge of her sleeve, still smiling, though now there was a flicker of uncertainty in her expression, as if she had expected the moment to pass without consequence, as if she believed everything would continue exactly as she had planned. Victoria, on the other hand, looked pleased in a quiet, controlled way, her chin lifted just slightly, her posture relaxed, as though she had established something important without needing to say another word. I felt the weight of years settle in my chest, not as pain, but as clarity, a slow understanding of all the small moments that had led here, the conversations I had brushed aside, the subtle exclusions I had chosen not to question, the polite smiles I had accepted when something felt just a little off. It is strange how quickly a lifetime can rearrange itself in your mind when you finally see it clearly. The music had stopped without anyone noticing, the soft melody fading into an uneasy silence that stretched longer than it should have, and still, Daniel did not move. He did not turn toward Emily, did not acknowledge the officiant, did not even glance at the guests who had come to witness what was supposed to be the beginning of something beautiful. He was still looking at me, and in that look, there was no confusion, no hesitation, only a quiet, unmistakable decision forming beneath the surface. I folded my hands together more tightly, feeling the smooth fabric of my dress beneath my fingers, grounding myself in something simple and real, because whatever was about to happen next, I knew it would not be small, and I knew, without needing to hear a single word, that the moment we were standing in was not going to pass the way everyone else in that room expected it to. It happened in a way that felt both sudden and inevitable, like a door that had been slowly closing for years finally clicking shut, and when Daniel moved, it was not dramatic or loud, but deliberate, the kind of movement that draws attention precisely because it is so controlled. It took one step forward, away from the altar, away from the future everyone in that room had already decided for him, and the small sound of his shoes against the polished floor seemed to echo far louder than it should have. The officiant began to speak, something about continuing the ceremony, about staying on schedule, but Daniel raised his hand just slightly, not in anger, not in frustration, but in quiet refusal, and that single gesture was enough to stop everything. The room stilled again, the kind of silence that no one knows how to break because no one knows what is about to happen next. Emily's smile faltered, just for a second, the edges of it tightening as she looked at him, waiting, expecting him to recover the moment, to smooth it over the way he always had, to protect the image they had built together. Victoria shifted her weight, her expression sharpening, her eyes narrowing as if recalculating, as if trying to understand why the outcome she had anticipated was not unfolding as planned. Daniel did not look at either of them. He turned, slowly, until he was facing the guests, the rows of people who had come dressed for celebration and now sat caught in something entirely different, something uncomfortable and real. "We are not going to continue," he said, his voice steady, clear enough to reach the back of the room without effort, and for a moment, no one reacted, as if the words needed time to settle into meaning. A soft murmur began to rise, scattered whispers passing from one person to another, but he did not wait for them to grow. "I will not stand here and pretend this is something it is. Nope," he continued, and there was no anger in his tone, only a calm certainty that made the words land harder than any raised voice could have. Emily took a small step toward him, her hand reaching out as if to touch his arm, to pull him back into place, to restore the version of the day she had imagined, but he stepped back before she could make contact, not abruptly, not harshly, just enough to create distance where there had once been trust. "Daniel," she said, her voice softer now, threaded with something that sounded like disbelief, "this is not the time," but he shook his head once, slowly, as if he had already considered that argument and found it meaningless. "This is exactly the time," he replied, and then, for the first time since he had moved, his eyes shifted again, not to Emily, not to Victoria, but back to me, and in that look, there was something that felt like recognition, as if he had finally seen something that had always been there. Around Buese, the room began to fracture into reactions, some people leaning forward, others turning away, a few quietly reaching for their phones as if documenting the moment would somehow make sense of it later, but none of that seemed to matter. The ceremony had not just paused, it had ended, though no one had formally said so yet, and standing there in the stillness that followed, I realized that whatever came next would not be about saving anything that had just been lost, but about revealing something that had been hidden for far longer than anyone in that room had realized. The first sound that broke the silence was not a voice but a chair scraping lightly against the floor, somewhere in the second row, the kind of small, accidental noise that suddenly feels too loud when everything else has gone still, and it was followed by a ripple of movement as people shifted, unsure whether they were witnessing something temporary or something final. Emily lowered her hand slowly, as if the air itself had changed, her fingers hovering for a moment before falling back to her side, and I watched the realization begin to settle across her face, not fully formed yet, but present, like a shadow moving just beneath the surface. Victoria stepped forward then, her composure returning in a practiced way, the kind that comes from years of controlling rooms, of shaping narratives before anyone else has the chance to question them. I think we are having a misunderstanding, she said, her voice smooth, measured, as if she could gather the moment back into something manageable if she chose the right tone, the right words, but there was a faint sharpness underneath, something that suggested she was not used to being interrupted, not used to losing control. Daniel did not respond immediately, and in that pause, the weight of his silence seemed to grow heavier, more deliberate, as though he was allowing every person in that room to feel exactly what had just happened without offering them a way out of it. There is no misunderstanding, he said finally, and his voice was calm, almost quiet, but it carried in a way that made people stop whispering, made them listen whether they wanted to or not. Emily shook her head slightly, a small, almost reflexive motion, as if denying the situation might somehow reverse it. You are overreacting, she said, her words quick, her tone tightening. It was just a comment, no one meant anything by it, and I noticed how she did not look at me when she spoke, how her focus remained fixed on Daniel, as though I were no longer part of the conversation at all. That, more than anything, clarified everything for me. Daniel let out a slow breath, not frustrated, not angry, just steady, as if he had already moved past the point where explanations mattered. That is exactly the problem, he replied, and then he turned slightly, just enough that his voice reached not only Emily and Victoria but the entire room. You think it means nothing? The words hung there, simple and undeniable, and I could see the shift in the audience, the subtle change from curiosity to understanding, from passive observation to quiet judgment. Victoria's expression tightened for the first time, her smile thinning as she glanced around, measuring the room, recalculating again, but this time there was something less certain in her posture. Daniel, she said, a hint of insistence entering her voice, this is not how you handle family matters, but he shook his head once more, that same controlled movement that seemed to close doors behind it. Respect is not a private matter, he said, and then, without raising his voice, without adding anything dramatic, he made it clear that whatever had been planned for this day no longer existed. I felt the room begin to separate into pieces, conversations breaking off, people standing, others remaining seated, unsure of what role they were supposed to play in a moment that no longer followed any familiar script, and through it all, I remained still, not because I did not feel the shift, but because I understood it in a way that did not require movement. Some things, once revealed, do not need to be argued or defended. They simply stand on their own, undeniable, irreversible, and quietly final. It is a strange thing to watch a room full of people slowly realize they are no longer attending a celebration but witnessing the quiet collapse of something they had dressed up for, and you can see it not in any single reaction but in the small, scattered details, the way conversations stop mid-sentence, the way hands that once held champagne glasses now hang uncertainly at both sides, the way no one quite knows whether to leave or stay because leaving would mean acknowledging what has just happened and staying would mean becoming part of it. Emily took another step forward, this time more carefully, as if approaching something fragile that might break further if handled the wrong way, her voice lowering, softening, trying to reshape the moment into something less permanent. Daniel, we can talk about this later, she said, her tone controlled, almost pleading now, as though privacy could somehow undo what had already been made public. There is no need to do this here. I looked at her then, not with anger, not with cruelty, but with a kind of distance that felt far more final, the kind that does not come from a sudden decision but from something that has been building quietly over time. Later is why this happened, he replied, and there was no hesitation in his voice, no searching for the right words, because he had already found them long before this moment. Victoria's composure shifted again, the careful balance she had maintained beginning to crack, not dramatically, but enough to reveal the tension underneath. You are embarrassing everyone, she said, her voice tightening, glancing briefly toward the guests as if their discomfort could be used as leverage, as if social pressure might still pull him back into line. Daniel did not even look in their direction. No, he said simply, that already happened. The words settled with a quiet weight, and I saw several people avert their eyes, not because they disagreed, but because they recognized the truth in it and did not want to be caught acknowledging it. I remained seated, my hands still folded, my posture unchanged, but inside, something had shifted, not a sudden surge of emotion, not relief or triumph, but a steady, grounded clarity that replaced the confusion I had carried for longer than I realized. It is not the loud moments that define you, but the ones where you choose not to react, where you allow the truth to reveal itself without interference. Emily's expression hardened slightly, the softness fading as something sharper took its place, something more calculating, as if she were beginning to understand that persuasion would not work here, that the version of Daniel she had relied on was no longer standing in front of her. "So this is about your mother," she said, and for the first time, she glanced at me directly, her eyes cool, assessing, as if measuring my importance in a situation she believed she still might control. Daniel followed her gaze for a brief moment, and when he spoke again, his voice did not rise, did not sharpen, but carried a certainty that made everything else feel secondary. "This is about what you showed me," he said, and in that sentence, there was no accusation, no explanation, only recognition. The room seemed to settle into that understanding, the kind that does not require further elaboration, and I realized then that whatever had been hidden beneath polite conversations and carefully managed appearances was no longer hidden at all. It had been brought into the open, not with force, not with spectacle, but with a quiet refusal to pretend, and that kind of truth, once spoken, does not disappear, no matter how many people wish it would. The shift in the room was no longer subtle now, no longer something that could be explained away with polite smiles or careful excuses. It had settled into something heavier, something that made people straighten in their seats or quietly gather their belongings, not because they were told to, but because they understood that what they were witnessing had crossed a line that could not be procede. Daniel remained where he stood, not moving back toward the altar, not stepping away from it either, as if the space itself had become irrelevant, as if the decision had already been made somewhere deeper than the room we were all standing in. Emily let out a small breath, the kind that tries to steady a moment that is slipping out of control, and when she spoke again, her voice carried a sharper edge, less composed, more urgent. "You are making a mistake," she said, each word measured but strained, as though she were trying to pull him back with logic, with certainty, with anything that might still hold weight. Daniel's expression did not change, but there was a stillness to him now that felt almost immovable, like something that had finally settled into place after a long period of quiet instability. "No," he answered, and the simplicity of it seemed to unsettle her more than any argument could have. Victoria stepped forward again, her presence more forceful this time, her voice no longer softened for appearances. "This is unacceptable," she said, her tone firm, commanding, as if authority alone might restore order. "You do not walk away from a commitment like this over something so insignificant." The word insignificant lingered in the air, and I saw Daniel's gaze shift toward her, not with anger, but with a clarity that made the distance between them unmistakable. "That is exactly why I am walking away," he said, and there was something in the way he spoke, something measured and final, that made it clear this was not a reaction to a single moment, but the result of something he had been seeing, understanding, and choosing not to ignore any longer. Around Buese, the room had begun to empty in quiet, hesitant movements, a few guests slipping out through the back doors, others lingering just long enough to witness how it would end, as if closure might be found in watching someone else's decision unfold. Emily's composure faltered completely now, the careful balance she had maintained dissolving into something more exposed. "After everything we planned," she said, her voice lower, "Taiter, after everything I have done for you," and there it was, not spoken loudly, not intended for the entire room, but clear enough to be heard by those closest, a shift from partnership to transaction that could not be. These guys once it had been revealed. Daniel did not respond right away, and in that pause, the meaning of her words seemed to settle more heavily than anything else that had been said. "That is the problem," he replied finally, his tone unchanged. "You think this is something you have done for me." There was no need for further explanation, no need to list grievances or revisit moments that had already passed, because the truth of it had already surfaced, simple and undeniable. He felt the quiet steadiness inside me deepen, not because the situation had resolved, but because it had clarified itself, because the confusion had been replaced with something far more solid. So many endings are loud, filled with arguments and raised voices, but this one was not. It was quiet, deliberate, and in that quiet, it carried a kind of finality that no one in that room could ignore, even if they wanted to. By the time Daniel turned away from the altar, the ceremony no longer existed in any meaningful sense. It had dissolved into something unspoken yet completely understood, and what remained was not confusion but clarity, the kind that arrives quietly and refuses to be undone. It walked past the front row without hesitation, not rushing, not slowing, simply moving forward as though the path ahead had already been decided long before anyone else in that room realized it, and as he passed me, he did not stop. But he did something far more important. He reached out just briefly, his hand resting lightly on my shoulder, not for support, not for reassurance, but as acknowledgement, as if to say without words that he had seen everything that needed to be seen. He did not turn, did not follow immediately, because there are moments when movement feels unnecessary, when understanding settles so completely that action becomes secondary, and instead I remained where I was for just a few seconds longer, watching the space he had left behind. Emily stood near the altar, her posture rigid now, the softness gone entirely, replaced by something sharper, something colder, and for the first time, she looked uncertain not about the moment, but about the outcome she had expected to control. Victoria moved closer to her, her voice low, controlled, speaking quickly in a way that suggested strategy rather than comfort, as though the situation could still be redirected. Eve handled correctly, but there was a tension in her expression that had not been there before, a recognition that something essential had shifted beyond her reach. Around them, the remaining guests formed small clusters, conversations hushed but intense, glances exchanged in ways that carried more meaning than words ever could. Because everyone in that room understood that what had just happened was not about a single sentence or a single reaction. It was about something that had been revealed in full view, something that could not be explained away later with apologies or excuses. Eve rose slowly then, smoothing my dress out of habit rather than necessity, and as I stepped into the aisle, the movement felt deliberate, not rushed, not hesitant, simply aligned with what had already been decided. No one stopped me, no one spoke, and that silence followed me all the way to the doors, where the sunlight outside felt almost too bright after the weight of the room I had just left. Daniel was waiting on the steps, his expression calm, not relieved, not shaken, just settled in a way that told me he was not questioning what he had done. For a moment, we stood there without speaking, the sounds of distant traffic and passing voices replacing the heavy quiet of the chapel, and I realized that whatever had just ended inside did not feel like a loss, not in the way people might expect. "Are you all right?" he asked finally, his voice steady, and I looked at him, really looked at him, not as the boy I had raised, not as the man standing in front of me, but as someone who had made a choice that would define far more than this day. I said, and I meant it, because there was nothing left to question, nothing left to doubt. Bimbuesi. The doors remained open, the remnants of the ceremony still unfolding in fragments, but neither of us turned back, because some things, once seen clearly, do not require a second look, and some decisions, once made, do not need to be explained to anyone who was not willing to understand them in the first place. The next morning arrived without ceremony, the kind of quiet morning that does not announce itself but simply exists, steady and indifferent, as if the world has decided to continue regardless of what has been broken or revealed the day before. He woke before the sun had fully risen, the light just beginning to filter through the curtains, and for a moment, I lay still, not because I was unsure of what had happened, but because I was aware that something had shifted permanently, not only in my son's life, but in the way I understood the years that had led us here. The house felt different, not empty, not heavy, but clear, as though something that had been lingering in the background had finally been removed without needing to be named. When I walked into the kitchen, Daniel was already there, standing by the counter with a cup of coffee in his hand, his posture relaxed in a way that did not suggest regret or second-guessing, only resolution. He looked up as I entered, offering a small nod instead of a greeting, and I returned it in the same quiet manner, because there are moments when words feel unnecessary, when understanding has already settled into place without needing to be spoken aloud. On the table in front of him lay a thin folder, nothing remarkable about it at first glance, just a simple collection of papers, but there was something deliberate in the way it had been placed, something that suggested it had been waiting, not for today, but for the right moment. "I met with my attorney last night," he said finally, his voice even, as though he were discussing something routine rather than something that would reshape multiple lives, and I felt a small, steady awareness rise within me, not surprise, not concern, but recognition. He reached for the folder, opening it slowly, not with hesitation, but with care, as if each page inside carried a weight that required respect rather than urgency. "There were things I did not fully understand before," he continued, sliding one of the documents slightly forward, not toward me, but into view, agreements, expectations, details that were presented in a way that seemed reasonable at the time. I watched him as he spoke, not the papers, because the truth was not in the ink or the signatures, it was in the way he held himself now, the absence of doubt, the quiet certainty that comes when something once hidden becomes undeniable. They assumed I would not look closely, he said, and there was no bitterness in his tone, only clarity, that I would trust what was given to me without question. He closed the folder again, his hand resting lightly on top of it, as though the contents no longer needed to be examined further. That will not happen again. Outside, the morning continued as it always did, distant cars passing, a neighbor's dog barking briefly, the ordinary sounds of a world that had no awareness of the shift that had taken place, and I realized that whatever Daniel had done, whatever steps he had taken after leaving that chapel, were not about retaliation or anger, but about drawing a line that could not be crossed again. He poured myself a cup of coffee, the familiar motion steady and grounding, and as I sat across from him, I understood that what had been destroyed was not something fragile or accidental, but something that had never been as solid as it appeared, something built on assumptions that could not survive being seen clearly. Are you certain? I asked quietly, not because I doubted him, but because I recognized the weight of what he had chosen. He met my eyes without hesitation, his expression calm, unwavering. Yes, he said, and in that single word, there was no room for anything else, no space for reconsideration or regret, only the quiet finality of a decision that had already reshaped everything it touched. The days that followed did not feel dramatic or chaotic the way people might imagine after something so public and unexpected. Instead they unfolded quietly, almost gently, as if the world had decided that what mattered most had already been said and everything else was simply a matter of time catching up to it. Daniel handled everything with the same calm precision he had shown that morning, phone calls made without urgency, meetings scheduled without hesitation, each step taken not as a reaction but as a continuation of a decision that had already been fully formed. He did not ask for details, not because I was uninterested, but because I understood that whatever actions he was taking were not about proving anything to anyone else, they were about restoring something within himself that had been overlooked for too long. Occasionally, pieces of information reached me in indirect ways, a message left unanswered, a conversation that ended more quickly than expected, the quiet withdrawal of people who had once been very certain of their position, and through it all, there was a pattern that did not need to be explained in order to be understood. It was not loud, not aggressive, not something that could be pointed to as a single moment of consequence, but rather a steady unraveling of expectations that had been built on the assumption that no one would question them. One afternoon, as I sat by the window with a cup of tea, watching the light shift across the yard in that slow, familiar way, Daniel joined me without announcing himself, taking the chair across from mine with the same ease he had always carried into any room. For a while, we said nothing, the quiet between us no longer heavy or uncertain, but settled, like something that had finally found its proper place. It is done, he said eventually, not elaborating, not offering details, and I nodded, because I did not need them. There was a clarity in his voice that left no room for doubt, no suggestion that anything had been left unfinished or unresolved. I looked at him then, not searching for signs of regret or relief, but simply observing the steadiness in his expression, the absence of conflict, and I realized that what had changed was not just the situation itself, but the way he carried it. Some lessons do not come with explanation, they arrive fully formed, undeniable, and once they are seen, they cannot be unseen. Good, I said quietly, and the word felt sufficient, complete in a way that did not require expansion. Outside, the afternoon continued as it always did, the breeze moving through the trees, the distant sound of a car passing by, ordinary moments unfolding without awareness of what had shifted within our small corner of the world. There was no celebration, no sense of victory, only a quiet understanding that something necessary had taken place, something that had restored balance not by force, but by truth. As the light began to fade, I stood and walked toward the kitchen, setting my empty cup in the sink, the simple motion grounding me in the present, and for the first time in a long while, I did not feel the need to revisit what had happened or question what it meant. Some things, once revealed, require nothing further. They stand on their own, complete and final, and all that remains is the quiet knowledge that respect, once lost, does not return in the same form, but it does leave behind something far more lasting, the clarity to never accept less again.